2021 season for 100 Thieves actually looks pretty bright when you consider their roster. So it's been announced recently that 100 Thieves have their full roster, which consists of Someday in the top lane, Closer in jungle, Demonte in mid lane, and FBI at ADC, and then support is rounded out by Huhi. So when you look at this roster, it's basically just a stolen Golden Guardians roster. Like, let's just be fucking honest. It's like that whole meme of, like, yeah, you can copy my homework, but just make sure you change some things. It's like, so he just added fucking Someday to the mix and called it good. But there was the explanation that Golden Guardians released a video stating that they were having problems with funding, of course, because of COVID, and they're tied to an NBA sponsor, which obviously the NBA got hit pretty heavily for COVID, right? So it's pretty excusable, that he's able to get this entire roster, and probably more so for a steal as well, because I think it was something like Closer also had a extended contract and whatnot, so they had to probably buy him out. And then, you consider maybe FBI judging, maybe, I don't know if his contract had ended for the 2020 season afterwards, but you could probably tell that he would demand a higher salary just based on how well that he did, and he fucking deserves the money, right? So I can see how this 100 Thieves roster came about to be, and then they kept their best piece in Someday, which seems like they're basically their franchise player, right? So considering this roster, obviously, let's start from top to bottom. Someday, absolute fucking monster. And what annoys me about Someday, or rather the fans, is that it seems like he doesn't get enough recognition. And the thing is that everyone knows that he's a great top laner. But when people start discussing maybe top 3 top laners within the LCS, or, who did well in summer or whatever, Someday's name hardly is ever brought up, which is fucking weird. And not only that, but when you consider things like All Pro or, like MVP votes or whatever, like Someday is rarely ever fucking mentioned. And that's pretty annoying considering how well he actually does against top lane opponents, or even just against the enemy team. And then also when he's put into a position to carry, he can actually carry very hard. But, it's not often that he gets the chance because his team starts crumbling all around him. But it's still impressive that he is able to look so damn good in spite of his teammates and how poor they were doing within the summer, right? So I think Someday, perfect piece to keep. It's something that you can actually build your roster around, right? Because he can play tanks, he can play carries, he could play split push style. He could do everything, essentially. He's like, I would say he's the better version of Impact. So hopefully he gets the fucking salary to compensate for that. But I don't know. We'll see if that gets leaked in the future. Now, rounding that out and complementing that is Closer. Now, I think Closer is one of the best junglers within North America. I mean, he was looking real hot in summer, just tearing up the entire league. Really good jungler. And it's not as though he has this very strict style in a sense. Like, he can play kind of a little bit control while also being more towards the aggressive side, right? He can carry games by himself and whatnot. We obviously saw that on Golden Guardians. So I think he's just a really good piece to pick up. And I think even if he didn't come as a package deal with the rest of Golden Guardians or whatnot, and you just kind of got him solo by yourself, like I think he would be a great addition to any team. So I think Closer is a fantastic pickup, and I'm curious to see as to how he's going to develop in terms of his other year now that he's coming into the LCS. And there's a lot that has been changed, right, within preseason. So it's always difficult to judge when a player will be on the up or when a player will be on the down, especially junglers for that matter, because jungle usually changes quite a lot. And now we have all the item changes and whatnot and all that shit. So we'll see. But very good pickup. Damonte, I'm not so hot on this one. I'm not completely sold on it. You know, obviously there are better mid laners. Now you have Perks in the LCS, so he's got another Giga powerhouse to compete against. Of course, I guess Bjergsen is out, right? So that kind of balances things out in that sense. But so you just have this ridiculousness that he's going to have to face against. You know, he's not going to win against Jensen. He's not going to win against Perks. So that's already two laners that he's just going to auto lose essentially from, right? So in terms of that, it's difficult to say how Damonte is going to have to then pick up the pieces on those other games that he can possibly win, right? Because I'm just going to count those two matchups out entirely just because of the skill discrepancy in that sense. So with that said, I don't think Damonte has that hard carrying capability in order to dish that out in some sense against the other 8 or 7 mid laners within the league in those other matchups, right? So, and especially considering, you know, Power of Evil going over to TSM, who is also a better mid laner. So it's just this whole congruency of top tier mid laners that he cannot possibly touch. But that's not to say that Damonte is necessarily a bad player in and of itself, but that he just doesn't strike me as the guy to put on the carry pants in that sense very hard, especially when you have someone like Closer and Someday. So that's why I'm not entirely so stricken that Damonte is on this team, because I don't think he really has to carry in that sense. So I think it's fine. It's okay for a placeholder. And you probably got him for a decent deal anyways. So that's a decent enough pickup, but that's more putting onto the faith that Someday or Closer can actually carry the games now. Then you go to FBI. FBI, fantastic pickup. One of the best ADCs in the entire LCS. He really impressed me in the summer. Golden Guardians looked like they were either going to win through Closer or they were going to win through FBI, right? So having this guy have those carry pants over in the bot lane and kind of be aggressive, be all in your face, and be able to pick up maybe the missing puzzle pieces of the rest of the weaknesses of this lineup is actually, I think, quite good. So this is a really good pickup. I think he's going to do, tons of damage in team fights and whatnot. He's good around objectives. He knows where to be. He knows where to place himself in terms of, where the enemy CC is or whatever, and how to maneuver himself in team fights, I guess. So he is one of the better ADCs within the entire league. So this is a great pickup. I think he's going to work really well within 100 Thieves. And then if you attach that with Huhi, we saw how aggressive they were actually in the bot lane and how surprisingly fucking well Huhi plays as support. I guess when you give a support hands, they tend to be pretty good since he's coming from the mid lane. But with that said, I think it's a little crazy to gamble on Huhi in that sense, right? Because he isn't this traditional support player, right? And so coming into the changing of the seasons, now we have the preseason coming in where you kind of have to rethink your whole imagination of how to play the game. And if you don't have this raw foundation of what it is to be a support and to play like a support, that maybe can sometimes get confusing in that sense, right? So Huhi is this sort of gamble, and I think 100 Thieves are making a statement to say that summer wasn't a fluke for Huhi and that he'll be able to perform in the spring of 2021. And not only that's the downside of it in that sense, but the upside of Huhi and how he's always stricken me as a player, watching him throughout the years, especially on CLG and whatnot, is that he strikes me as a player that has ingenuity, right? He has the ability to think up different strategies or maybe different champion picks. I mean, he got to play, what was it? He got to play Lux, Morgana, and Set, when other players either had difficulty picking up, a champion like Set, or they just didn't have the balls or the confidence to pick up something like Lux or Morgana within the current meta. So I think Huhi is going to help a lot in the spring in that sense, because we have, this entire preseason and whatnot with all these broken items and shit, and everything's all changing. And so now Huhi is going to be able to use his skill set for the spring and say, hey, here are some new ideas. Here are some things that I've been working on. This champion is pretty OP because of this item or whatever. So I think in that sense, and also his proclivity to pick up champions so quickly. Now, that's not to say that Huhi masters champions in that sense, but he is able to pick champions up quite quickly, to a 80% capacity or a 90% capacity, right? But he won't necessarily reach that 100% mastery or, the 95% mastery. So I think he's a good addition, especially in consideration of the spring, coming up and all the new shit coming out. So it's a good gamble, I would say. And then to round all that out, Freeze coming in as the assistant coach, I think is a pretty good idea in general, because not in essence of just because it is Freeze or who Freeze is as a player. I think Freeze generally, what he's going to bring to the team in terms of his old player mindset is that he was a decently consistent ADC. He was never particularly bad in a sense, but he was never great, right? So he just kind of got left behind. I would say he got left behind with the times in that sense, but he always had good fundamentals and whatnot. And so when you then transition him over into the coaching role, I think he's going to complement Zix quite well, in the sense that he can come from a micro perspective versus Zix is going to come from a macro perspective, right? That's the benefit that you get if you have a former pro player on the coaching staff, is that they'll be able to tell you all of your micro mistakes, and maybe you should have moved over here and done this, or maybe you should have used this certain skill instead of using this other skill or whatever. So he's going to be able to have all those little micro inputs in that sense and be a quasi positional coach. So I think that's a pretty good pickup. Now that is hidden of if he's actually a good assistant coach or not in general, but I think the theory of it is quite good. Now, while I say PapaSmithy has rigged the primary just as a joke on the election or whatever the fuck, I think what he's done this year is pretty good. It's foolproof in that sense, in that he just picked up the entire Golden Guardians roster and then fucking dropped in someday. So I don't see how it can go tragically wrong in that sense. And I feel like this team can potentially shoot for fourth. I think at the very best, right? Because you have Cloud9 and you have Team Liquid at the top, obviously, and then you probably have TSM, maybe, I don't know, depending on how that roster shakes up. But I think that at least 100 Thieves are going to make the playoffs. Of course, their roster has quite clearly very strong players within the top jungle and ADC, and that should be enough to carry them over the line anyways. And PapaSmithy has done a wonderful job, I think, and I criticized him a lot last year in terms of, picking up this OS player and whatnot and kind of taking a chance on that. And but at the end of the day, he also in part probably developed the 100 Thieves Next program, which takes, high schoolers or people underage and kind of tries to help develop them into the academy system to where other teams can pick them up or whatever. And then you have his academy system, which for the most part, is pretty like untouched in that sense. And also he's been willing to try multiple different rookies, right? Like different players, names that you haven't necessarily heard of a ton. And I think that's the way to approach the academy system. And also to let Kelsey Moser have this kind of autonomy in that sense, right? And let her do her own thing so that she can set up systems and whatnot and not be affected by the main LCS roster. So I think 100 Thieves is one of the few teams that is kind of doing this whole amateur thing correctly in a sense. So I got to give kudos to PapaSmithy and also for him just constructing this roster. I think it's pretty legit. So yeah, I think 100 Thieves has a pretty good chance next season. I don't think they're going to win spring split or whatnot, but I don't think you design this roster right with that in mind. It's just something to get by a little bit and also produce decent results, and maybe, I don't know, you get a miracle run of getting third or something if other teams start to explode. So this is a pretty good bet. I like the bet that he put on Huhi specifically. I think that there's a little bit more nuance there than people are initially going to give it. With the spring season and his innovation and whatnot. I like his pickup of Freeze. And I just think overall this is a decent roster.